if I remember correctly, you studied chemistry and history, which
Yes,
is
I did a double major.
okay, so interesting combination. I mean, I guess history in a way can kind of be applied to any topic. So in a way, it's not actually that, in a way, not that unusual, but I don't think I've seen many people with exactly that kind of background. So I'm just curious, why those two topics?
Gosh, so when I was in college, I went to this very small school in North Carolina, Davidson College. We're best known probably as the alma mater of Stephen Curry, who is a basketball superstar now. But while I was at Davidson, I had this great career plan. I was going to go to law school and I was going to be a patent attorney. And that's how I got into studying chemistry. My idea was that the chemistry degree would be a leg up applying to law schools because that would be a bit of an unusual background. I loved history. I kept taking courses in it. I got far enough along that I thought, well, I might as well just finish the history major. And as I was getting deeper and deeper into studying history, I really fell in love with the field of history of science. And I realized that I didn't really want to be a patent attorney. And I really also didn't want to go to graduate school in the sciences. That it turned out that I liked writing about scientists and their institutions and their stories a whole lot more than I liked being in the basement of a chemistry laboratory trying to figure out why my experiments weren't working. So I pivoted. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to do a one-year master's degree at the University of Cambridge in the history of science. And after that, that was that. I was completely in love with the field, and I decided to move forward to graduate school. And then after that, I bounced around a little bit. My academic trajectory was a bit unusual, but I'd be happy to talk about that more later.
So two questions. First is, so in the US then, I guess it differs a bit between countries, but so I guess then in the US or maybe the contrast is, I think in Germany you kind of just study law. That's like your degree from the beginning. But it sounds like in the US, it's more of you do something else and then you do law. That's just whether you could clarify that. And the actual question is, that's a very specific job idea for someone in school. Why that exactly?
Gosh, so I'll answer the second question first. I had done mock trial camp as a student in high school, and I'd really enjoyed it, and I got it in my head that I wanted to be a lawyer. And so I started looking into different fields in the law, and I found out that there was a thing called patent law, where basically you could apply scientific knowledge to the practice of law. And I thought, well, I'm really good at science, I'm really good at math, and I want to be a lawyer. This seems like a great fit. This is perfect. And so I really did kind of start off college with that idea in my head, with law school as my goal, and the idea that I would set myself apart as an applicant by being a chemistry major who wanted to be a patent attorney. So it started as something extremely nerdy in high school. And then, yes, in the United States, you generally don't major in law as an undergraduate. You also wouldn't necessarily major in being pre-medical, in the study of medicine. Those are considered just graduate programs in the US. So usually you major in something else for your undergraduate degree, and then you apply to law school or you apply to medical school, and that's where you get your qualification.
Okay. So, I mean, the main thing, I guess, well, not the main thing, but what we'll be talking about, I guess, today is mainly the history of the journal Nature, the history of peer review, the history of what it means to be a scientist, and what we can consider someone who does science. From what I understand, the one part with the history of the journal Nature then started pretty early. I mean, that was your PhD, basically, right?
It was, yes. It started as my PhD research, and then later I expanded it into my first book.
So was that... Yeah, I find it's so funny because, I mean, as I mentioned before we started recording, that, there's lots of things that, when you're a scientist, you know about, and, there's all these different aspects, but you often presume that it's kind of the way it's always been, like the way it is today is the way it's always been. Which, I mean, basically couldn't be further from the truth with nature. So I'm just curious, like, how did you, basically, what got you interested to do a history of a specific journal also?
That actually also started with something extremely nerdy in high school. To make extra money in the summers, I worked for a little bit at the university library at the university where my parents worked, the Colorado School of Mines. And one of my big jobs was journal counting. So what I would do is I would take a big cart and I would go all up and down the floors of the library, picking up specifically the scientific journals that people were reading. So this was 25, 30 years ago. This was before most people were accessing journal articles online. And it was my job to count which journals were being pulled off the shelves most, so that the library would have data on which subscriptions they really needed to renew. What were the journals that people were using heavily. And so that's how I got interested in journals, and that's how I became aware of a hierarchy of journals, that some journals were considered high impact and necessary for the library to subscribe to, and other journals were considered more marginal, maybe subscriptions that could be cut in the event of a budget shortfall. And I kind of carried that interest with me through my chemistry degree, and I started getting more familiar with different types of journals. I got interested in Nature specifically because its format seemed so unusual to me that an article in Nature didn't really look anything like an article in the Journal of Physical Chemistry B, for example. And then in graduate school, I decided that I wanted to know more about the history of scientific publishing. And Nature seemed like a really great case study, in part because it's so unusual. It's considered a scientific journal, even though it does a lot of things that most specialist scientific journals don't do. It has a news section. It has commentary. It has a very active letters to the editor or correspondence section. And so I wanted to dig a little bit deeper and find out exactly why Nature was so unusual, and why, despite it being so unusual, it seemed to occupy this really lofty place in the hierarchy of scientific publishing.
So how did it start? What was the glorious beginnings of Nature?
Oh, well, the glorious beginnings of Nature arguably starts with the not-so-glorious demotion of its first editor, Norman Lockyer. Norman Lockyer was an astronomer. He was a British astronomer, and in the mid-19th century, in Britain, science was not necessarily a stable career. Lockyer's day job was working at the War Office. He had a government job, and astronomy was something that he really did in his spare time. And that's how most people did scientific research at that time. It would have been very unusual for a man of Lockyer's generation to earn his living by doing scientific research. The jobs just didn't exist yet. So Lockyer was moving happily along, working at the War Office, doing his astronomical research on the side, and he picked up a little bit of extra money by doing some consulting for the Macmillan and Company publishing group, or publishing house. The Macmillans used Lockyer to consult on their scientific books, which were a very profitable wing of the Macmillan publishing empire. And so Lockyer had this really nice income knit together until there was a reorganization at the War Office. He got demoted. His salary got cut almost in half, and he was incensed. He was furious, and he decided that he was going to find some other way to make his income. So he approached the Macmillan Company and asked them if they would consider bankrolling a new scientific periodical and installing him as its editor. And the Macmillan Company said yes. And that was the beginning of Nature. That was how Nature got its start. And it wasn't just about the money for Lockyer, I should say. Lockyer had long had this vision of a journal that would be by scientific researchers, but read by a broad cross-section of British elites. He and his friends were watching the rise of scientific periodicals that were written by journalists, and they were very frustrated that qualified scientific researchers didn't seem to be a big part of that conversation and didn't seem to be a big part of that popularization of science. They felt like the science journalists often got things wrong. Lockyer's friend T.H. Huxley was very concerned that a lot of these science journalists seemed to be women, which he didn't approve of. And so they were really trying to create a periodical that was by scientific researchers, but for people who were laymen, for people who were not necessarily qualified researchers themselves.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing for me was also like really how it, And I think this was not. So you also had this article called "In Referees We Trust," and you there had this section which I copied out because I found it quite funny when you think of the first journal, because we just imagine something quite different than what it is today. So you wrote, there was not even a formal submission process. Oldenburg, the founder, or who was Oldenburg again? Just very briefly.
So Henry Oldenburg was the founder of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London, which was, it's a periodical. It's a much older publication, founded in the 1660s. It's generally considered the world's first scientific journal. And there's a whole lot of mythology about it that turns out not to be true, but...
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention what the journal was. And yeah, sorry. Anyway, so about this journal, you said, there was not even a formal submission process. Oldenburg would simply print what interested him and what he thought might be of value to his readers, including not only experimental papers, but second-hand accounts of others' experiments, discussions of recent books, and even his own personal correspondence. And so, end quote. And to me, it seems like that's a kind of... Nature was somewhat in that vein, in a way. Maybe, more for the general public than for scientists per se, but I find it just funny when I read that, because that's basically like a blog, right? For how we would think of it today, where people you collect some stuff you find interesting, you put it there, or like some people have YouTube channels that do roughly similar things. And I just find it funny that like these journals that have this very specific format today, basically, it seems like they started out much more as a kind of very casual and loosely defined collection of different stuff about science.
They really do. The first scientific journals are much more eclectic than the ones that we know today. And the thing with Nature that I think shaped its content a lot in the early years is that it's a weekly publication. If you've worked in magazines, if you've worked in publications, weekly is a tough schedule. You have to constantly be generating new ideas, new pieces, and Lockyer was always out there hustling, to use the modern word, for pieces that he could print in Nature to meet this incredibly demanding weekly publication deadline. And so there's a lot of stuff in Nature that is going to make, the first issues of Nature, I should say, that is really going to make a modern reader scratch their head and wonder, what was anybody thinking? There are poems, so the very first article ever published in Nature is a translation of aphorisms by Goethe, the great German Romantic poet. And that was very deliberate. That was Lockyer and his friend Huxley who did the translation. That was sort of their grand statement about the beauty and cultural importance of science and nature, the title they chose. But there's also a lot of stuff that is in there primarily because Lockyer has got to get an issue out. And I think that is something important to keep in mind when reading these early issues of Nature, just how much pressure Lockyer was under to keep the journal publishing on that rapid weekly schedule and to hopefully generate a profit for Macmillan and Company so that they ended up, so that they would continue to bankroll Lockyer's project.
Yeah. Weekly schedule is also hard for podcasts. I've tried it. It's if you want to have guests, it's genuinely because like if you have to have a weekly thing, you have to, if you want to take some time off, do more than weekly for the rest of the year, right? So I imagine that. I mean, also one thing I imagine is that like at the time, the printing press was obviously a thing, but I think it would be a bit easier to have a weekly schedule these days than back then when everything had to be sent by mail. Presumably the printing wasn't maybe quite as, automized and fast and that kind of stuff as it would be today, I imagine at least. So yeah, weekly schedule was, in hindsight, when you think about it, like almost 200 years ago, it's crazy.
Yeah, so John Maddox, who was a very influential 20th century editor of Nature, once wrote in an essay that he thinks one of the big factors that enabled Nature to do what it did in the early years was the Royal Mail, which at the time delivered incredibly quickly. Some multiple times a day, the postman would come. I've done work on the correspondence of a physicist named John Tyndall, and we've found letters in his correspondence where he and a friend are responding to each other multiple times in a day because they can just hand their letter to the postman and it'll be taken to the other side of London and then the reply will be back after lunch. So the speed and reliability of the Royal Mail was a big factor in enabling this to go forward. But yeah, even so, it's really astonishing to think about a weekly periodical being published in the age of steam-powered printing. When you couldn't just post everything online, you actually had to print it, bind it, and have it delivered.
Do you think he could have done that in any other country, or was really the particular Royal Mail? I mean, basically, the question is how serious was that statement by Maddox? Because I mean, genuinely, especially if what you mentioned there with several a day, I mean, that's faster than I often correspond with people by email, right?
Yes.
So do you think he could have? Do you think there's actually some real truth to that, or was it more of a joke?
I don't know enough about what the mail systems were like in Europe at that time to say that, they couldn't have done it in Germany, or, they couldn't have done it in Switzerland. I don't know that they could have done it in the United States at that time, because the country was so much more scattered and so widespread, and a lot of its population centers were so distant from each other. And that's actually one of the really interesting things that I learned as a historian of science, was just how backwater the United States was in the 19th century compared to the great scientific centers in Europe. That, for example, Ernest Rutherford, a great physicist who worked at McGill University in Canada, he was an important contributor to Nature. And he was offered a job at Columbia University, and he turned it down flat. He didn't want to go to America because he considered it scientifically not even second class, more like third class.
Yeah, and I think you also wrote that he pretty much tried to get back to the UK very much from McGill, even though it was very well funded. It's just there was no one else there, and it was a bit lonely, I guess, compared to being in Cambridge or London or whatever.
Yes, yeah. Rutherford, from almost the moment he got to McGill, he was working to get his career to a point where he could be hired at a British university. He really wanted to go back to what he considered to be the epicenter of the scientific world.
So we mentioned the Royal Mail earlier and the weekly schedule, but that's not just, I guess we didn't mention it just as a curiosity, but from what I understand, that was also actually a crucial part to how Nature became. I mean, maybe we should trace the history first a little bit more in terms of, it obviously didn't end up becoming something just for the general public, but in particular in becoming important for scientists. How was the weekly schedule important there? Why does that matter? What the frequency is,
Yeah, so the weekly schedule of Nature ended up mattering largely for the letters to the editor section. So what I saw studying the history of Nature was that Nature never really found the audience that Lockyer imagined it would have. He had this vision that Nature would be read by barristers in London and members of parliament and men of letters, sort of the literary scholars who were considered the intellectual giants of the day. And Nature never really had that kind of readership. And the big reason for it is that Lockyer was really set on having only scientific researchers write for his periodical. It turned out that by the 1870s and 1880s, researchers were much more interested in writing for each other. And what had changed from when Lockyer was a young man was that now there were paid permanent scientific jobs. There were things like university professorships and government-funded researcher positions that a younger generation of scientists were working in, and they wanted to advance in those positions, and advancing in those positions depended not on the opinions of men of letters, but on the opinions of other men of science, as they called themselves at the time. So Lockyer's contributors were much more interested in writing specialized articles that were of interest to other researchers, and that really ended up pushing Nature in a much more specialized direction. One of the reasons that scientific researchers really liked writing for Nature, even though it had kind of this weird mismatch between audience and contributors, is that there was a letters to the editor section that could get things in print very quickly because of that weekly schedule. And so British researchers found that if they wanted to engage in a scientific debate, or if they had a new scientific finding that they really wanted to announce and get in print quickly, letters to the editor was perfect for that. And so Nature's weekly publication schedule actually ended up giving it an advantage when it came to attracting a certain type of contribution from men of science in Britain at the time. And I'm using that term specifically because that was what they would have called themselves. And the gendered element is very deliberate, but I will stop there.
Yeah, I think, I can't remember where this was, but you also had this general, what I find kind of funny, at some point then there was a discussion about the term scientist, whether
Yes.
it should be used or not. So what was the problem there with the term?
Oh, man.
Why?
So the problem with the term scientist kind of depended on who you asked. In the 1920s, there was a debate in the Letters to the Editor column about whether Nature should start using the word scientist. And the people who didn't want to use it had a couple of problems with it. So first of all, a lot of them thought that it was an Americanism, which it wasn't. It was a word invented in Britain by the British polymath William Whewell in the 1830s, but it was much more popular in America at that time. And so a lot of contributors thought that it was an Americanism and it was nothing that belonged in a respectable British journal. But there were also a lot of concerns that scientist was just too vague a word. And people preferred to be called a physicist or a zoologist or a botanist, something that identified their expertise more clearly. They were worried that scientist as a term was so vague that just about anyone could lay claim to it. And if they started calling themselves scientists, they would unintentionally be identifying themselves along with a bunch of other people who they considered essentially frauds. So they're really worried about kind of holding up the boundaries of their community and making sure that only respectable researchers are considered part of the community that they identify with.
Yeah, I found that an interesting part in the book on Nature about the late 19th century, when there was this whole who's part of the club, who's not part of the club.
Yeah.
And this whole who's allowed to comment on things, who is, I think, I can't remember what it was now exactly, but you had this one section where, there was a politician who'd once published a paper, and then based on that, he became Fellow of the Royal Society. And then, 20 years later, I guess he'd been a politician and then wanted to comment on scientific matters in Nature. And one of the main criticisms was well, you're a politician, what do you know? And I just find it interesting how that in these, I guess the second half of the 19th century, that just, as you said, it became from this gentlemanly kind of thing you do in your spare time to, no, you have to be someone who commits to this and does it full time.
Yes, and that to me is the big story of science in the 19th century, how it goes from being something that people do for the sake of the love of science. And, often they have to invest their own income into it, and they have to find another job to support their scientific work because it's not a source of income. And then by the end of the 19th century, it's actually a career trajectory. You can train to become a botanist or a zoologist or a physicist, and you can expect to earn a living doing that. You can expect to earn a living doing scientific research. And that is a big change for the British scientific community. And I think that it's a change that reading Nature really helps you track. Yeah,
and I think you mentioned the first article in Nature, the translation by Goethe. I mean, he, I guess, resembles that stereotype, at least in Germany, of someone who kind of did everything, to something. I mean, he was a novelist, a poet, a playwright, but then he also worked in court for decades, and he wrote his scientific books. I don't know how well they, stand up to time now, whether there's actually anything valuable in there, but it's kind of interesting to me that that's actually the very first article starts off that way, and then from then on, that just changes completely.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, Goethe is a great example of sort of the classic polymath, the type of person who kind of by the end of the 19th century just doesn't exist in the same way that he did at the beginning of the 19th century. And again, I'm saying he because these spaces were very often closed to women by deliberate choice.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, people like Huxley, very explicitly deliberate choice.
Yes, Huxley did not have a high opinion of the intellectual abilities of women. Although I will say here that Norman Lockyer himself, the first editor of Nature, he was actually quite a supporter of women's rights, especially by the standards of the time. So when the physicist Hertha Ayrton applied to be the first female fellow of the Royal Society, Lockyer supported her application. He authorized editorials in favor of women in science being admitted to things like the Chemical Society. His second wife was very, very, very active in the British suffragette movement. So it wasn't all men of science who were necessarily opposed to the equal rights of women, but you definitely see pockets of it among Nature's early contributors.
Yeah, I think he had a beautiful quote. Unfortunately, I didn't write it down, but it was something like, again, it was also this discussion about you have to be a practicing scientist to actually count as one. And then there was this discussion where, one woman was supposed to be allowed in or be allowed to comment on things or whatever. And what was it? It was like, basically like, why should we exclude these people from it? Or was it like something like just because they didn't have the privilege of being able to grow a mustache or something like that? And,
yes. And there's some wonderful early editorials in Nature arguing that women who are researchers ought to be admitted to these kinds of professional societies and ought to be welcomed as part of members of the community because they're doing research, because that is increasingly considered the rule for membership in the scientific community. It goes from a system where the Royal Society of London kind of welcomes anyone who is sufficiently interested in science and also able to pay the dues, to a system where you really have to have some serious research bona fides to be considered for fellowship in the Royal Society.
Yeah, I mean, I think these days it's slightly harder than it was in the 19th.
A little bit harder now.
Yeah, just a little bit. I mentioned at the beginning that this was, I guess we're tracking three histories in a way that kind of go in parallel. One of the general nature, two of what it means to be a scientist, and three peer review. So maybe what was going on with peer review at the time? How did you get into Nature in the 19th century?
Oh boy. In the 19th century, honestly, in the first decades, to get into Nature, you have to, there is a minimum bar. Lockyer is not just going to print anything. He's not going to print flat earth stuff. He's not going to print, anything that he considers crazy or disreputable. But if you clear a very minimum bar for scientific credibility and you submit it on time, you're going to get into Nature. Because weeklies are incredibly content hungry. Lockyer does not have enough time to reject a whole lot of stuff. And he certainly does not have enough time to send anything out to referees. So one of the things that I learned while studying Nature was that in the 19th century, there's really no system at Nature that resembles what we would consider peer review today. And that surprised me a little bit. I realized as I was working on this project that I didn't really know much about the history of peer review. I'd seen evidence in correspondence that other journals, like the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London, were using something like a referee system. But there definitely wasn't anything like that at Nature. And so I kind of started tracking when I started to see evidence that referees were being used. It turns out that it was not until 1973 that every paper in Nature had to have referee reports in order to be published. And I was really shocked when I found that out. For a moment, I actually thought that I had uncovered some great scientific scandal and that, I sort of went home from the interview with David Davies, the editor, who made it a policy that everything had to be refereed to before publication. And I thought, oh my God, can I print this? Am I going to get sued? Is this a big scandal? But it turns out that that's actually not that uncommon. That peer review as a system is far younger than I had understood it to be. And that this idea that something has to be peer reviewed to be scientifically legitimate or scientifically credible really doesn't crop up until the Cold War. And that was kind of the genesis of my second book project, which is on the origins of peer review in the sciences.
Is peer review to some extent then a bit of a... So one thing I find interesting, I think you wrote that, for example, I think in the Annalen der Physik or whatever it was mainly Max Planck, I believe, right? Who was kind of the editor of that, and who just decided whether stuff was good enough or not. And to some extent, I think there's a kind of understanding that maybe he knows a bit of what he's talking about. As much as like bias and that kind of stuff might crop in, like, you know, if you have an editor like that, it's slightly different than if it's just some random person. So is peer review to some extent then just a natural consequence of the specialization of different research areas where at some point no one really knows anymore all these different things? Or is there something else that's also going on?
Yeah. So I would say that there's nothing necessarily natural about the story of peer review. That what struck me as I started to sort of unravel the story of where refereeing came from and how it spread is how haphazard it was. So the very first publications that tended to adopt refereeing systems were publications affiliated with what we call learned societies, places like the Royal Society of London. And the major reason that the Royal Society of London and other scientific societies wanted to have refereeing was not about making the papers better. There was no such thing as a revise and resubmit decision. So it's not about making the papers better. It's not about making the journal better. It's largely about social factors. It's largely about the desire to maintain the society's reputation by making sure that nothing obviously terrible is printed by the society. And it's also about social cover for the editor, because it's very, very awkward in these kinds of gentlemanly spaces when a senior fellow who's been a member for a long time comes to you with an absolutely terrible paper. And your editorial board doesn't want to print it. The editor doesn't want to be the person who sits down with him and says, okay, Bob, this is really not great. We can't print it. Telling Bob that the referees found the following problems with it is a much gentler solution to the awkward social problem. So the history of peer review is a lot about social factors. In fact, I would argue that it's a lot more about social factors than it is about epistemological factors, about anything focused on making the science better or more true. And for a long time, you have journals that use referees and you have journals that don't, and they're considered equally reliable by the researchers who read them. Because ultimately, the readers think that the responsibility for whether or not an article is good and high quality work is not necessarily with the journal, it's with the author. And so you have a system where non-peer-reviewed Nature and peer-reviewed philosophical transactions or proceedings of the Royal Society of London, those are both legitimate places for a researcher to publish. Today, of course, if you've got a great article that you think is terrific science and you want it to get a hearing from your peers, you would never send it to a non-peer-reviewed journal, because that's not the case anymore. That you can publish in some place that's not peer-reviewed and have it considered scientifically reliable or scientifically rigorous in the same way that a peer-reviewed article is.
So one thing I just realized whilst you were talking, and this is a thought I've had much before. So there's basically this difference between the arts and the sciences in terms of editing, like outside editing. So I did lots of music, and especially in my teenage years, and the idea that, you know, some editor would come and tell Beethoven or Chopin or whatever, well, that's not really how you, or, you know, that's not really how you write a symphony or a sonata or whatever, is ridiculous, right? Like, they just do what they do, and then they publish it, and then people like it or they don't. And also, I don't know exactly what it was like with, you know, novelists or whatever of the century, but my impression has always been that, especially like, let's say before the 20th century, you do what you do and either people like it or they don't. You know, that's kind of it. Maybe there's some like small editing around it, but not really that much. Now, one big difference, I guess, is that, you know, in science, you're trying to say that something's specifically true about the outside world. So that's the difference. But I'm just curious, like in a way these days, it seems fairly obvious that having peer review might be a sensible idea. As many problems as there are with it. But I'm just wondering, like, to what extent did it maybe take that long for people to realize that it might be a good idea just because it's very specific to science in itself? Or Do you see what I mean? Like that, basically, like, especially when everything was mixed in like the early 19th century, like it seems kind of weird that, let's take Goethe again as an example, like he can write his plays and all these kind of different things, and he can just do whatever he wants there. But then, like, why would they then start having some random person comment on his scientific work?
Yeah. So I think that one of the reasons that we don't, I think that often the way that we imagine the story of peer review is that it gets invented and then everyone is like, oh my God, what a great idea. Why weren't we all doing this? Let's all do it now. And that was very much the story that I expected to find when I started working on this project. That's not at all how it happened. And I think the big reason is that the system of trusting editors worked so well for so long. You had people like Max Planck at the Annalen der Physik, who was basically selecting the papers that went into his journal by himself, but he's Max Planck. He's one of the greatest physicists of his generation, you know. Who is going to say, oh yeah, well, Max should be reaching out to all of these other people who are not as well qualified as he is to help him make the decisions? That sounds crazy to people. And a lot of journals had editorial boards of people who were experts in different fields. And so they had people in-house who could evaluate contributions without having to send them out for outside refereeing. And so it really wasn't obvious to a lot of working researchers or to the people who were running the journals that the kind of labor-intensive, time-intensive refereeing that learned societies were doing was something that they wanted to expand to all publications. The reason that it does expand in the late Cold War, which is what I'm arguing in the book that I'm working on, it expands in the early Cold War because science starts expanding. And so one of the case studies that I look at is the journal Science, which is the American equivalent of Nature. And I say that because very explicitly in the first issue of Science, the first editor says, we want Science to be the American version of Nature. But what the Science editorial board finds in the 1950s is that there's been a huge expansion in federal funding for science from the US federal government, and there are more young scientists being trained. They are producing more papers. They are sending more submissions to Science. And the editorial board is just drowning. They absolutely cannot keep up with the volume of submissions. And so they decide to start consulting referees, not because they think it's a better system than what they've been doing, but because they need the work. They need help. They cannot keep up with the volume of submissions that's been happening. So it's not about making the journal better, it's about reducing the workload for the editorial board. There's this wonderful quote in their editorial board meeting minutes where they say, the editorial board agrees that the task of reviewing and suggesting revisions on dozens of scientific papers is not pleasant, satisfying work. And so basically, you can feel how exhausted they are and how tired they are of having to go through all these papers themselves. And that's the point at which they pivot to a refereeing system.
So, I mean, as you mentioned, you're working on a book project on peer review. So I've only read your article, Scientific Autonomy, Public Accountability in the Rise of Peer Review in the Cold War United States, which is published in the beautifully named journal ISIS. I'm not entirely sure where that comes from. But I guess the point you're making there is that it's also, I mean, as the name suggests, it's about accountability. It's about justifying, your work and that you deserve to get paid and continue doing this kind of stuff. So could you maybe briefly describe kind of how you got to that conclusion?
Yeah. So in studying the history of refereeing, I realized that you have this 19th century story of some journals use it, some journals don't. Researchers publish in both kinds of journals, and it's sort of a mishmash of systems. So I got interested in the question of how did we get from that situation to the situation we have today, where if you are a scientist, you publish in peer-reviewed journals, end of story. No other type of publication is considered valid for promotion, tenure, hiring, etc. What I found was that a lot of the rhetoric about peer review being something central to science could be traced to a very specific historical moment. And that very specific historical moment is fights over how to award U.S. federal grant funding for the sciences. So in the 1960s and 1970s, you start to see legislators push back on all of the money that the US federal government has been spending on the sciences. It's an economically tough period, especially as you get into the 70s. There's a period of stagflation where there's high inflation combined with high unemployment. The government is looking for ways to cut the budget, and organizations like the NIH and the NSF get in the government crosshairs. And you have legislators start to argue that scientists should not be involved in deciding how the federal government spends its money, because you've got these systems at NIH and NSF where scientists give advice on which grant proposals they think are the best and they think should be funded. And there are certain forces within the US federal government that say that's not the way we should be doing things. Why are these outside scientists being allowed to come in and tell the feds how to spend their money? And the scientists respond that, well, we're giving expert advice. We are giving peer review of the applications for grant money. And if you want to fund the best science, you have to use peer review. And that's really where you start to see the argument take hold, that peer review is something central to science. It's something that you have to have in order for science to work properly. So basically what I argue in that article is that the reason that scientists start describing peer review as something central to their work is to preserve their autonomy when it comes to determining what kinds of grants, basically how science should be funded going forward in the United States. They don't want legislators telling them which grants to fund. They certainly don't want legislators telling them which research projects to pursue. So they lean on peer review as a way of maintaining space for scientists to help decide where the money goes for scientific research.
So I have one very broad question here, because I, know very little history. So whilst I was reading the article, I thought it was very interesting, but part of me also thought but how do you know that's where it comes from in a way, right? Like the kind of, okay, like it started becoming more popular after World War II. Maybe it was even at the same time, right? But so I'm just curious, from the perspective of someone who's not read a lot of historical research, how do you know that how do you think about these kind of factors in establishing that is an important reason, and not just some story as a couple. So basically, some stories a couple of scientists told some politicians and they never thought about again after that.
Yeah, it's tracing the origins of an idea is really hard. So in the book that I'm working on, I have a line early in the book where I say, okay, if we're imagining, what was the first instance of peer review? It's probably some mathematician in an ancient civilization who, asks his friend, does this look right? Before committing it to sort of a more permanent form of recording. Tracing the origins of an idea is hard. What I try to do in my work is trace language. Where do I see people saying that peer review is something central to science? Where does that kind of language first crop up? So that means that I look at a whole lot of discussions about how science should be evaluated. I read a whole lot of correspondence between editors and grant officers, seeing how they describe their jobs and how they think of the role of the referee. And I try to kind of plot out patterns and see where I start to identify language about the referee being something central to science really emerge. And so I think it takes hold among scientists and among the broader public during these controversies about federal grant review in the 70s. But I think that one of the groups that really starts using this kind of language is actually sociologists and philosophers of science in the 1950s and 1960s. So you have this group of scholars that's interested in studying scientific institutions, and they start to identify the refereeing process as something that is central to scientific knowledge making. And in my book, I specifically call out a pair of Columbia sociologists, Robert Merton and Harriet Zuckerman, longtime collaborators who did an incredibly influential study of refereeing at Physical Review. And I really think that a lot of this language about the referee as central to scientific knowledge making comes out of that field of science studies, which was not a finding I was expecting, but which I think is really, really interesting.
So it's basically the argument that the sociologists start picking up on this and that then influences how scientists do their work? Or is it more that this is a commentary that's running parallel to it? And because basically the reason I'm asking is that unfortunately, I can't remember where I read this, but I remember reading somewhere once from a very eminent scientist who wrote like I can't remember who it was, but like one of those like big science names, just saying something like, even like philosophy of science is kind of like, I think the particular criticism was like, people like Francis Bacon, people say that's where the scientific method started, but the guy basically didn't really know what he was talking about, and people ignored him until like 100 years later or something like that. So I was just reminded of that. So I'm just curious, like, is the argument specifically that they influenced the way scientists thought about the value of peer review?
Yeah, that is the argument. And I think one thing to remember, or one thing that I think is important for understanding that claim, is that people like Merton were widely read among scientists. So in the 1990s, we had this period that we call the science wars, where sociologists, philosophers, and historians of science found themselves very much at odds with scientists about the way that the field of science was described, about the way that scientific truth was conceptualized. And I think that a lot of modern scholars have kind of the science wars as their point of reference for how sociologists, philosophers, and historians on the one hand interact with scientists on the other. That is not at all true in the 50s and 60s when Merton and his contemporaries are active, because they are interested in scientific institutions. They are interested in describing what they believe makes the scientific community unique. And scientists are really interested in their work, and they find it very compelling and very influential. You see the works of people like Merton and Thomas Kuhn and Michael Polanyi. It's widely reviewed in scientific publications like Physics Today, like Nature, like Science. Scientists are enthusiastic about Merton and his findings. You've got the US federal government coming specifically to Merton to get him to consult on their grant-making processes at the NSF, because they see him as the great expert on how to identify good science and how science ought to be run. So I think that's one important thing to keep in mind when thinking about this argument, is that in the 50s and 60s, these groups of sociologists were very respected among natural scientists, and they were seen as experts in what they did and people worth listening to.
So you mentioned that in Nature, only in, I think you said 73, it became standard practice that peer review was applied to every article, research article. I guess there's still different types of things that are published there. But was Nature late to the game, or was that pretty standard that most journals until that time had a kind of a bit of a, as you said, some of them had it, some of them didn't. So basically, I guess my question is like, okay, so the argument for peer review starts in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Was then at that point like peer review pretty much universally accepted, or did it take even longer? Or, what's the story there?
It definitely took even longer. It's not, there's not sort of one moment where suddenly everybody adopts peer review and sees it as completely necessary. One of the findings that really surprised me as I was working on this project is that during the Cold War, America is seen as unusually reliant on referees. And so for a British commercial periodical, something that is for profit, that is not affiliated with a learned society, 1973 is actually not late to be adopting these kinds of systematic refereeing systems. That's actually pretty typical. Because commercial periodicals were often much later than learned society periodicals in adopting refereeing systems. So it's definitely not late when we consider the fact that Nature is a commercial journal and that it's outside the United States. Because I've found a lot of correspondence and a lot of published editorials indicating that the Americans were seen as being kind of weirdly obsessed with this strange, quote-unquote, peer review idea. As late as 1989, British medical journal The Lancet was running editorials saying that, in the US, they're weirdly focused on peer review, but don't worry, at The Lancet, editors make the decisions. And we consult reviewers for advice, but they don't make the decisions. We editors make the decisions. And that's 1989.
Not that long ago. Yeah, one kind of very easy question about the future is kind of like, in a way, like the question is obvious, right? Like, where's this going? Because to some extent now it feels like, so number one, in the fields that I care about, there's a journal eLife that now basically is technically they're not a peer-reviewed journal anymore, because I think the editors basically say, okay, you have to pass right now the current. So I think they implemented this like a year or two ago. You still have to like desk rejection. You're still at that stage. But once the editor thinks like, okay, this is interesting enough, they send it out to peer review, and then the authors can publish it either in the original form or whatever. So, but the peer reviews will be published alongside it. But there's not this stage anymore where you say like, oh no, look, the peer reviewers found this problem, therefore we're going to reject it. But instead, they just publish the peer reviews, and the authors from what I understand, they can publish the article kind of the way they want to, either the original version or they update it with comments by the people and that kind of stuff. And obviously that's not happening in isolation. Archive and these kind of things and preprints have been around for, I guess, about 20 years now, or 30 or something like that, in various forms, and very widely accepted in some fields, especially from what I understand, mathematics and, well, the more mathematical stuff like physics and computer science, as a standalone product, right, from what I understand, often, not just like in psychology and neuroscience where you publish it as a way to get it out early and then you still have to publish it. And, one thing I'm hearing more and more these days is that editors are really struggling to get peer reviews for articles, and that it's just really hard to get good people to, spend the time to basically, especially if it's a for-profit journal, give them free labor. So I'm just curious kind of where you, amongst all of this, you see like this rise of peer review becoming more and more accepted. And now, I don't know, it feels like we're going back again because it's just, as a whole functioning system, maybe not working particularly well.
Yeah. So the thing that I really feel is happening right now is that the modern peer review system has a labor problem. In the 1950s, the editorial board of science started reaching out to referees to solve their own labor problem, but now the size of scientific research has become so large that it may have outgrown the solution that the science editors found, which was to start relying on external referees. Because, studies have consistently shown that acceptances for peer reviews have dropped, and they dropped a lot during the pandemic as people were kind of triaging, trying to keep their workloads manageable while also having their kids at home all the time. A situation in which I found myself, certainly. And we're also in a situation where full-time jobs for scientific research are becoming more and more competitive. And if you are a young researcher and you're in a postdoc, or if you're a young researcher in a tenure track job and you know that in 6 years you've got to submit your CV to find out whether you get to keep your job or not, do you want to spend 2 hours in your laboratory working on your own research, or 2 hours refining your own paper that's going to, help get you to that next career milestone? Or do you want to give 2 hours of your time for free to Elsevier to review someone else's paper? And so a lot of scientists, just out of self-preservation, are having to say no to the papers that they are asked to referee. And, none of that, I certainly don't want to accuse scientists of being selfish or self-interested or not ever doing this, because, I ran across a study that calculated the number of man hours that scientists spend every year on refereeing, and it's somewhere in the billions. It was a really eye-popping number. I'll look it up and see if I can find it for you. Scientists still do this as much as they can, but every editor that I've met and talked to about this project has told me it's so hard to get people to say yes to referee reports these days. So I think modern peer review has a labor problem. And there's no real easy solution in my view, because a lot of the experimental forms of peer review that I read about, like having people, find papers and comment on them publicly instead of soliciting referees, or having referees kind of consult with each other and with the editor to generate just one report that the authors have to respond to, or writing a referee report that's going to be published alongside the original article the way eLife does. I think all of those are really good and interesting innovations. None of them solve the labor problem.
And there's no obvious solution on the horizon.
I mean, the solution is more permanent academic jobs for scientists, and maybe finding some way to confer professional rewards for doing referee reports. But When you suggest that, there's often a lot of pushback, because one of the features of the referee system for the scientists who were arguing that this was central to science in the 70s was that peer reviewers were supposed to be completely disinterested. You weren't supposed to be getting paid for it. You weren't supposed to be getting any professional credit for it. The reason that it worked, according to the scientists who really pushed it as a central feature of science, was that peer reviewers had no personal stake in doing this. They were doing it solely for the good and the support of the scientific community. And whenever I see somebody, say, propose a small honorarium for doing peer review, I will immediately see scientists pushing back and saying, but that's not what peer review is for. We're not supposed to be getting personal benefits from it. They're really uncomfortable with that idea, and I certainly understand why. It is antithetical to how we've been taught the peer review system works.
Yeah, I find it interesting because, especially at my career stage, I finished I started my postdoc less than a year ago. There is an actual benefit to doing peer review because you can, put a note of the journal on your CV that you reviewed for that kind of stuff. Obviously, at some point you lose that incentive, but I think that's pretty much like, for me, it's also useful, to see the other side. Sometimes you can get very annoyed with peer reviewers, and then you review a paper yourself, and you go like, "Oh, I'm annoyed about the thing that they were annoyed about." maybe my initial article was just annoying in certain ways. So it seems like if you're at a more junior position, there is an actual benefit to doing it, to understanding the whole thing. But yeah, at some point, it's just I guess like a sense of obligation or something like that. And yeah, I do wonder what happens, because then again, as soon as you start paying stuff. Well, I guess I don't know what would happen, whether there would just be people who would just be doing that all day. But then at some point, they're also just editorial staff for a journal, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of, they become freelance editorial staff. And yeah, it's a challenge for sure. And I can kind of feel editors' desperation as they try to solve this problem. I have a dear friend who has a physics PhD, got a very prestigious postdoc, ended up transitioning out of academia because he couldn't find a permanent job in the sciences in his field. And he works for a bank now, doing data science, and he still gets referee requests. People look up where he is now based on the papers that he published as a postdoc. And they're like, "Dear Dr. Jones, this paper cites your work. Can you please review it for us?" And, he always has to answer no. That's not what his job is paying him to do. And he certainly doesn't want to donate his free time to writing a referee report when he feels 12 years out of date on the current science. So yeah, it's a problem at a whole lot of levels.
Yeah. So I guess is it just the kind of situation where, the problem is just going to keep getting worse until we reach some sort of moment of crisis when something has to happen, and then we'll see what. Or is it just different solutions? People will suggest different solutions, and then we'll, organically find out maybe this works a bit better than this. And yeah, I don't know, because it seems like the way that. Yeah, as you said, I guess in the way the whole thing is that more and more people are scientists. So there's more and more, the initial problem from the, whatever it was, early 20th century. And I don't see that changing drastically anytime soon, even if it just stays at the current level, right? Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because it seems like there's a big problem that everyone's aware of and no one really knows what to do.
Yeah, and I think that one of the problems is that, there is one obvious science that would solve the labor problem in one fell swoop, and it's getting rid of peer review. And that is a solution that I have seen seriously floated among some science communication scholars, among some philosophers of science. But it's a solution that I don't think is going to go forward for very good reasons. And the major concern that I have as a historian of peer review is that what I've seen in the history of peer review is that the quality of science is only ever a minor consideration in the way that peer review changes science and in the way scientists adopt peer review. I almost never see people saying, "Oh, well, we have to use referees because they'll make the science better or because they'll make the journal better." It's much more about social factors. It's much more about factors like trust and respect between scientists or trust and respect between science and outside stakeholders. And the thing is that scientists have for decades described peer review as the key to scientific credibility. We talk about peer review by qualified scientists as the way that you know that a scientific paper is more reliable than some blog entry on an anti-vaxxer website. So peer review has become key to public trust in scientific reliability. You can't just get rid of that in one fell swoop and expect that there are not going to be any consequences for public trust in science. And I think that people who are interested in eliminating peer review are aware of that as a problem, but I haven't really seen any good solutions for how do you maintain that relationship with a broader public and with broader stakeholders if you start overhauling or getting rid of the thing that you've told them makes science special.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I heard once someone say is something that, well, I heard someone say that someone else said, so it's a bit indirect, but it's an interesting idea, I thought, that basically in the future there will be maybe, there will still be the big journals. There will still be Nature, there will be Science, there'll be whatever, but like all this other stuff that currently, is, probably like, let's be like 95% of the research or something like that, right? All these like small journals that you publish in, and that, is obviously important for cumulative science, that kind of stuff. But that maybe all that stuff will kind of just be preprints. And then when we have like the big, basically when people want to make like a big statement every once in a while, then that will be a, peer-reviewed journal, and everything else is just going to be work in progress more. I don't know. I find it funny because in a way it goes back to, in many ways the way it was, not exactly back in the day, but, when they wrote the books and that kind of stuff. So more like you have like the major events, and then, almost like when I think back to like, I guess what you wrote about the mid-19th century, it was kind of expected that people published their major books where they had their major discoveries. And then the kind of smaller stuff was done at the meetings of the societies and these kind of things. Because in a way that would, I guess it would to some extent still maintain certain standards for certain aspects while reducing the workload. But I also don't know whether that just doesn't solve the problem at all. I find it very difficult.
I think the difficulty too, one of the difficulties is that the peer-reviewed paper has become sort of the relevant unit that people count for job applications, tenure, and promotion. And part of why we have such a voluminous publication of scientific papers is that people are trying to make their CV look better. They're trying to get as many papers into print as possible to illustrate that they are productive working scientists. And as long as we're working in a system that counts only peer-reviewed research as sort of the unit that can go towards tenure and promotion in the sciences, or we're going to have a system where people insist on only publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and they're not just going to want to post something on the archive and call it a day, that they're going to, continue to push to publish in some kind of peer-reviewed journal so that they know that their work counts for their career. So I think that until those career incentives really change, I don't know that I see a big shift coming in how scientists publish. I'm not saying change is impossible. In fact, I think that we're in something of a moment of crisis given the labor problem associated with peer review. But I think that finding a solution that acknowledges career realities for young scientists, that keeps in mind this question of public trust and respectability, and that, maintains some of the features that we might like about peer review, like having consistent communication between you and your scientific peers about your work. There's a lot of moving parts, and I don't think that there's an obvious path forward for scientific publishing. I think that we may just have to try out a couple of different solutions and see what sticks.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely seeing some things I'm seeing now that, I've started writing like fellowship and grant applications and these kind of things. It is interesting to see that most of them that I've applied for so far, well, not most of them, about half of them. So half of them had, no restrictions in a way in what you can say about what you did with your research. But then there's also others where they say, So the Swiss National Foundation right now, or Swiss National Science Foundation, for example, they have this narrative CV now where you have like 3 boxes. You can mention like 3 accomplishments. I mean, within that you can cite multiple papers. So in a way, it doesn't really eliminate the problem per se, because I guess someone who cites 4 of their own papers and each of them rather as 3 still looks like they did more. But I don't know. I am seeing some of these things where people say like, tell us about like the 5 best publications or most relevant of yours or something like that. I mean, again, there are others who just have none of those restrictions. But I do wonder whether just saying like kind of just show me your best work to some extent eliminates the whole like, oh, let's try and get papers 21 and 22 out also, just for the sake of it.
Yeah, I think that is one solution that seems promising to me, that maybe some of the professional rewards could shift to on a scholar's, 3 best or 5 best, depending on the career stage, rather than considering the overall length of the CV. And I think that one nice feature of that system is that it gives scholars the opportunity, scientists specifically, the opportunity to talk about what they specifically did in a collaboration. Because, it's not the case anymore that most of a scientist's best papers are going to be single-authored things that he or she did entirely on their own, right? They're working with a large number of collaborators. And so giving people the opportunity to talk about their 3 best papers and what they did to contribute to them might actually be a really good way of, solving this sort of ballooning CV issue.
Okay, so that's a semblance of a start of a solution. But yeah, I mean, obviously I didn't expect you to have by the way, I figured it out.
Well, he's bad at predicting the future. I should have admitted that at the start. Historians are terrible at saying what's going to come next. Yes, but I feel like historians are particularly bad at it somehow. Maybe because we feel like we should be able to predict what happens next based on what's happened in the past, but it turns out history is not a predictive science.
You mean like because it's easy, in quotation marks, to draw a straight line through a couple of events, it's maybe leads to the prediction like, oh, then it's just going to continue, like, even if it's not a straight line, even if it's a curved line or whatever, right? Like you can connect the dots, but like it's going to depend on influences that we don't even know are influences right now or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, anyway, on your website, you also mentioned one thing that I thought was kind of interesting, or to be completely honest, my note on this is Tyndall, why, ? Because you basically say that you're part of a group of people who transcribe all the letters by a guy called Tyndall who lived in the 19th century or something like that, or the correspondence at least. What's that? What's going on there?
Oh, so,
and who is Tyndall? Because I didn't know who was. I mean, he appears in your Nature book, so I don't know whether that gives a clue to how you found out about him.
He does. Yeah. And that is actually how I got the job. So when I was finishing my PhD at Princeton, I applied for a couple of jobs, and the job that I got was as a postdoc at York University in Toronto, working on the John Tyndall Correspondence Project. And John Tyndall was an Irish-born physicist. He was born in 1820, we think. His birth date was not terribly well recorded, so there's some debate about whether it was 1820 or 1821 or 1822. Anyway, he was born roughly 1820, and he ended up moving to London. He got his PhD in Germany, so he teaches himself German in the span of a couple of months, enough German to go to Germany and to get a doctoral degree in mathematics. And then he comes back to the UK and he makes his career as a lecturer. He's a professor at the Royal Institution. He delivers these public lectures on science and what it's doing today. They're kind of grand spectacles, very fashionable tickets for London society. And he's also the person who identified carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, or he's one of the first people. It's kind of a case of simultaneous discovery, but he is the most famous person who made that scientific claim. So the project that I was hired to work on was to transcribe all of his correspondence, so all of the letters to and from John Tyndall. And Bernie Lightman, my postdoctoral advisor at York University, he wanted to do this because he's interested in science popularization, in how scientists talk to the broader public about why science is interesting and important. And Tyndall is the perfect person to study if you are interested in that question, because he was incredibly famous in his lifetime. He did a whole lecture tour of America. He delivered a famous address at the British Association for the Advancement of Science, arguing for scientific naturalism, basically taking supernatural explanations and religion out of science. The professor of the Royal Institution, he's very influential on sort of London society's understanding of what science is. So Tyndall's a perfect person to study if you are interested in this question of science popularization and how science goes from something in the 19th century, which is considered a little weird and not all that intellectually reputable, to at the end of the 19th century in Britain, science does have social respect, and scientists do have a much more secure place in society. So that's kind of the story that I see the Tyndall letters telling. And it's been a lot of fun. I mean, there are just pockets of the most unusual things that you would never expect to find in the correspondence of a scientist. So I'm working on volume 19 now, which is towards the end of Tyndall's life. And he's corresponding with people like this actress named Fanny Kemble, who, she's fascinating. She's British. She kind of got swept off her feet by an American heir, and she marries him in England, and she moves to his plantation in Georgia, where she is promptly horrified by chattel slavery. She is appalled by what she sees, and she becomes a very outspoken abolitionist. She ends up divorcing the plantation owner. She has to give up custody of her daughters, but as soon as they reach their age of majority, they're on a boat to England to be reunited with their mom. She resumes her acting career. She publishes a very widely read book of her memoirs about what she saw while she lived in Georgia. She's a fascinating person, and Tyndall just meets her in the Alps, where he has a second home, and they correspond about mountaineering and the time that Tyndall was nice enough to show them, an easy walk for ladies to do in the foothills of the Alps. And you get to meet, quote unquote, all of these just really fascinating 19th century figures. So I've had a lot of fun working on the project.
So the actual work is that then there's an archive somewhere where people... So is it mainly there's an archive with all the letters and then it's, reading them, transcribing them? Or is it also the process of getting letters that are, scattered throughout the world?
Yeah, great question. By the time I came onto the project, Bernie and the rest of the project members had already collected all of the letters and they had digitized copies. So early on in the project, I oversaw the initial transcription of the letter where basically, you would just put up the handwritten copy and then you would type out what you saw. And then it would go through a couple of stages because often there were words in the handwritten copies that were difficult to read. And so you'd kick it up to a higher level transcriber and you'd say, okay, I'm not sure about this word, so I put it in brackets. And then the higher level transcriber would say, oh, well, that's obviously this name of a Swiss city you've never heard of. And so that's what I was doing early in the project. And now we're in the stage where we actually get to publish the letters. So we're taking those transcriptions and we're annotating them with information like, okay, who is this Fanny Kemble person? What is this Swiss city that she refers to in her letter? Things like that, just giving historical context to enable a reader who, doesn't have exhaustive knowledge of the 19th century sciences to understand what these people are talking about in their letters.
Is this project I guess my question is a bit whether it's a means to an end or whether it's also an end in and of itself. So is the idea also to have, a full understanding of this man's life and then a biography can be written based on that or something like that? Or is it also just, I don't know, I've never really read someone's personal correspondence. So, or is that also part of it, just having those annotated books and that's kind of it, and it's not supposed that's where it's supposed to go and not any further?
I think our vision for the volumes of Tyndall correspondence is that this is going to continue to be a research resource for people who kind of can't go to every single archive all over the world to see all of these letters. Because the thing is that there wasn't just one archive that we got to pull from. A lot of Tyndall's letters were held at the Royal Institution, and so we got a lot of letters that way. But we've got letters in the correspondence from the British Library, from the University of Cambridge Library, from, random libraries all over the world that just happen to have a couple of Tyndall letters somewhere because he was corresponding with a person who is in their papers. So in collecting all of these, we do really want to give people a full picture of Tyndall, the person, what his life was like, where his interest in the sciences came from, etc. But we also really hope that it's going to be a resource for any historian working on 19th century science, because there are things like correspondence with this famous abolitionist. There's a lot of discussion of health and medicine and what it's like to visit the doctor and to have a chronic illness in the 19th century. Tyndall had a lifelong struggle with insomnia, ended up addicted to opiates. A lot of his friends write about their health problems in their letters, so it really gives an interesting window onto 19th century medicine. And there's also a lot of stuff in there about politics. Tyndall, Irish-born, he very passionately believed that Ireland should be part of the United Kingdom. He was not a supporter of Irish independence at all. And so there's a lot of correspondence in the letters between Tyndall and like-minded people who really were against this idea of Irish home rule. And I think it gives a really interesting window into why someone born in Ireland who is very proud of his Irish heritage ended up on the conservative side of that debate, arguing that the Irish should not get home rule.
What was one? I don't know how directly relevant this is, but it just reminded me of something, which is, it's kind of funny to me that like how letters are such a useful tool for historian and biographers. So I remember, what's his name? Walter Isaacson, who did, I remember when he wrote the Steve Jobs biography, someone who was still alive when he started doing it. And then I believe died during the writing process or something like that. But he'd also written biographies about Einstein and other people who, lived during the letter era. And one thing I found funny is that he mentioned that, like, you can find Einstein's letters, but you can't find Steve Jobs' emails from, like, the 1990s. Like, there's just, all of that stuff is just gone, basically.
Yeah.
So I find it kind of funny that, like, letters and paper are a very good way of storing information for 200 years or something, even if it's, some random letter he sent off to someone 200 years ago. Well, not 200, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, paper and pen turns out to be a remarkably stable technology.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe final question about Tyndall then. So that's just something you're continuing working on with some other assuming you did this chronologically, you're reaching the end of his correspondence, or like what's the kind of plan with that kind of project if it reaches its end? Yeah.
We're really close to the end. I'm a co-editor of Volume 19 along with my colleague Shane McCorristine, and Volume 20 is scheduled to be the last volume of letters. So we are really close to the finish line with the project, which is exciting. I've been working on this since 2010 when I finished my PhD and started my first job. So it's really thrilling to imagine all 20 volumes sitting on a shelf next to each other, representing all that work by so many scholars all over the world.
And then you want to do more stuff on Tyndall, or just like a completely different project, or just not decided yet?
Not decided yet. I have this idea that I might work on the career of a psychologist named Frederick Wortham. He's famous in the US because he came up with a theory that reading comic books led to criminality. And he was very passionate about this theory.
So when was this?
This was the 50s and 60s.
Okay.
So he's very passionate about this idea. He's a very skilled public communicator, and he ends up being really influential over the U.S. Comics Code. So because of his research, there are actually rules put in place about what can and cannot be depicted in comic books and where comic books can and cannot be sold. And I'm really interested in his story because it's about this intersection of scientific expertise and public trust and legislation, which are all sort of issues that I got interested in working on the peer review book. And Wortham has papers at the Library of Congress, so once my peer review book is finally done and in the hands of the publisher and out of my hands, I may start poking around there.
Yeah, but I guess it's also slightly rude to ask about like not even the current projects, but Yeah. Okay. Cool. Is the peer review book then in its final stages, or what's the?
It is. It's actually currently in the hands of my peer reviewers.
Okay.
Working on peer review gets very meta at a lot of weird points. So right now, the completed first draft of the manuscript is in the hands of referees. They're going to send me their feedback. I will revise in accordance with that feedback, and hopefully by the end of the year, I will have the finished book in the hands of the press, and it'll move from there to publication.
Exciting. Unless you have anything else, I'll go to the recurring questions. Okay. So at the end of each episode, I ask my guests to send me 3 questions. And by now, actually, usually with the same phrasing also, it's kind of just like over time burnt itself into it. The first question is, what's a book or paper you think more people should read? It can be famous or unknown, old or new, just something you think, more people should read.
Okay, so I would admit up top that I am about to recommend a book by my graduate advisor. Okay. I get no kickbacks from this. I get no preferential treatment of any sort. But a book that I think more people should read is The Pseudoscience Wars by Michael Gordon. And I love this book because it's the story of somebody who was a scientific outsider. And usually the way that we think of stories of scientific outsiders in the history of science is that, but they were right all along and now they've been vindicated, huzzah. This is the story of a scientific outsider who has not been vindicated, and for very good reasons. His name was Immanuel Velikovsky, and he had this theory that the reason that there is so much catastrophe imagery in mythologies from all over the world is that there was a major collision with what is now the planet Venus, sometime in our ancient history. And that the reason that we have things like the Grand Canyon, and the reason that we have things like the Noah's Ark flood myth, and all of these other mythological tales of catastrophe, is because at one point the Earth collided with the planet Venus. And Velikovsky really believed that he was onto something, and he really thought that this was a scientific theory worthy of discussion. And there were entire peer-reviewed journals devoted to Velikovskyan theory. So they kind of set up this whole shadow ecosystem of Velikovskyan journals, where, of course, all of the peer reviewing is done by other Velikovskyans. And I love this book because I think that it's important to understand, especially at a moment when public trust in science seems a little shaky. I see a lot of people like, anti-vaccination activists arguing that sort of their branch of the sciences is the new Galileo, that they're being punished for their theories and when they are obviously correct, and later they will be vindicated. And I feel like it's important to understand that in the history of science, sometimes people are Galileos who are speaking truth to power and being punished for it, but sometimes people are Velikovskys. And that is a part of the history of science too. And it also gets into some really thorny questions about what is and is not science, and it's a very thought-provoking book, so I recommend it to anyone interested in the history of science.
That sounds great, and I feel so bad for the guy that now being a Velikovsky is at least in some circles, a term for something that he probably doesn't want it to mean. But that sounds fascinating, and the guy sounds... I mean, like, for me, he sounds very wacky was what I was going to say. But for me, the main question is, like, how would collision with another planet exactly explain those things? But maybe I should read the book.
Well, he's a Freudian, so there's a whole lot of Freudian theory that goes in there, too. It's sort of collective trauma, collective memory, things like that.
Okay. Yeah, sounds interesting. Second question is something you wish you'd learned sooner. This can be from your work life, from your private life, whatever you want. Just something, if you'd learned it a bit sooner, maybe your life some problems would have, might have helped you a little bit. And if you can or want to, also like maybe what you did about it or how you found it out or whatever.
So I've been thinking about this a bit because you'd indicated that this would be a question you'd ask. And I remember a really important moment for me in my career was reading an essay by the comedian Amy Poehler. So I mentioned very early in the interview that I had kind of an unusual academic career trajectory. I graduated out of my PhD right after the 2008 economic crash, and did end up in this great postdoc working on the Tyndall correspondence. But after that, I just bounced around between, 1-year positions, 2-year positions, adjuncting. And I kept applying for tenure track jobs, and it seemed like it was never going to happen for me. And, that's very hard when you've invested so much of yourself in your education and in this career path, and it seems like you're not going to get to keep doing it. And you're kind of thinking, what am I going to do with my life if not this, if there are not opportunities to do this? And I read this book, Yes, Please, by Amy Poehler, and it's got this great essay in there called Treat Your Career Like a Bad Boyfriend, where she talks about how your bad boyfriend doesn't come around when you're desperate and needy and, you're seeking his approval. Your bad boyfriend tends to knock on your door when you've got other things in your life going on, when you are happy and fulfilled for reasons that have nothing to do with him. And then the essay closes with this wonderful line, and remember, if your boyfriend treats you really bad, you can always go kiss someone else. She doesn't use the word kiss. But I am going to keep the actual word out of this podcast. And I remember that was really eye-opening for me. The idea that your career should never be the only thing that gives your life meaning, the only thing that is the source of your self-esteem. And eventually I did transition out of academia. I took a position as an editor for Physics Today, a magazine published by the American Institute of Physics. I got to continue writing about the history of science. I got to learn a whole new skill set, which was science writing and editing. And I eventually did end up back in academia, hired to a tenured professorship of history, which I had not expected when I decided to leave. But it turned out that was really good advice. Treat your career like a bad boyfriend and remember that it can't be your only source of happiness.
Yeah. Is just a quick follow-up is how did you then get the professorship? You'd left. I don't know, like how different what you did there was to what you do now, but I feel like in some circles it can obviously happen. For me, it's like, I've seen cases where people go to, I guess these days, especially if you go to DeepMind, Google DeepMind, that's not really even, it's kind of leaving academia, but also in some ways it's very easy to go back again after that. But yeah, so I'm just curious, like how different was what you did there from what you did before and after, and like how did you then end up getting this job? Because it sounds like you didn't apply for it, right? Or
Oh, no, I did.
Okay.
I absolutely did apply for this job. Went through the Zoom interview and then the on-campus interview and was eventually offered the position. Yeah, so I think that the key to how I was able to transition back into academia was that when I took the Physics Today job, I had a draft of an article that I'd been working on. And it's the article that was later published as Scientific Autonomy, Public Accountability, and the Rise of Peer Review. I'd been working on this article for years, and I decided, you know what, I really want to publish this. And so in my off time, on my personal time, I continued editing the article. I pulled it together into a format that I was pretty happy with, and I sent it to ISIS, which is the flagship journal of the History of Science Society. It goes through peer review, it eventually does get published, and it came out right as the University of Maryland was advertising for an associate professor. And my advisor, Michael Gordon, actually called me up and he said, you should apply for that job. And I said, that's crazy. I've never been an assistant professor. They're not going to tenure me. And he said, well, at the University of Maryland, the standard for tenure is a book and major progress towards a second project. And you now have a book between covers. That's my nature book, and an article that shows major progress toward a second project. Throw your hat in the ring. See what happens. And they liked the article. They liked the book. I went to the on-campus interview and they liked my job talk, and they ended up making me the offer. So I think that keeping a foot in the world of research is what really helped me transition back into academia. But that said, the big difference between working at Physics Today and working in an academic job is that research was not part of what I was hired to do at Physics Today. I would not have felt good about coming to my desk in the morning and working on my personal peer review research unless I was doing it to publish an essay for Physics Today. kind of pursuing independent research was not part of my job. It was not part of what I was supposed to be doing for 40 hours a week. And so when I published that article on peer review, I really kind of thought of that as the last academic thing I was going to publish, because I no longer had a job where, my boss was going to say, well, yes, of course you should go and take a month and live in England and read all of these archival papers. That was not part of what I was hired to do at Physics Today at all.
Okay. What I find interesting there is just the, getting something that you thought you weren't even eligible for.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how common that is, but I've definitely had some of the things that I applied for and got were things where I thought sometimes writing an entire application for stuff in 2-3 hours, just not being able to polish anything or whatever, right? And it wasn't presumably as competitive as getting as a professorship. But yeah, I find it funny that a lot of the times it seems to me that just trying something actually gets you very far, because you often don't know really whether you're qualified for something or not.
Yeah, and I guess maybe that's another piece of advice that I would get, is that it never hurts to throw your hat in the ring. Even if you think that you might not quite be what you're looking for, what they're looking for, it never hurts to try. It never hurts to put yourself out there. Rejection is scary. Rejection can really hurt. But don't ever let feeling like you're 90% qualified, but not 100% qualified. If you're 90% of the way there, go ahead and apply. See what happens.
Yeah. I don't know whether that was the answer to my final question, but the final question was advice to full PhD students or postdocs, people on kind of that border, maybe with a slight reminder that academic disciplines are very different. So exactly how things work in history, I don't know. But I've definitely seen that in economics, it's very different from psychology and neuroscience, even though some of it is basically the same work. So a lot of economics to me seems like a subdivision of psychology, at least the stuff that I interact with, and yet completely different norms and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, any advice?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things, as an American, I find this kind of a scary moment to offer advice on academic careers, because we are watching just a massive disruption, and disruption may not even be strong enough a word. But the way that science is funded and run in the US seems to be in a moment of rapid change. So for listeners who are outside the US and considering applying for positions in the US, I would say my big advice is familiarize yourself with what's happening to science funding in the US right now, and consider whether that is a move that you actually really want to make. And you should probably also read what's happening with US immigration cases at the moment too, because I think that this is a very challenging moment for international scholars to come over to the US. On a less depressing note, I think that my big piece of advice to any young academic would be to remember that you are not your career. That if you are not seeing the career success that you were hoping for, if you are rejected for a job that you thought you were a really fantastic fit for, so I had an experience of getting all the way to the campus interview for a job and just falling in love with it and then not getting it. And I think I cried every day for a month. It can be really emotionally hard to be on this track on this academic track. And so, yeah, the big advice I would share is make sure there's stuff in your life that gives it meaning that is not your job. And remember that, you are more than your career success.
Yeah, the worst is when you think you're going to get something also, isn't it? When you're like, I've got this, and then you don't.
Yeah, I mean, and in that case, the feedback I got from the committee was so kind. They're like, we loved you. You were fantastic. It's just that this other person was a little bit better of a fit for what we thought we wanted. And I was like, oh, thank you. That's so nice. And then, I hung up the phone and immediately burst into tears because I really had fallen in love with that job.
Yeah, the whole it's not you, it's us kind of thing.
Yeah.
Doesn't help. So thank you very much for your time and your questions. Looking forward to the peer review book.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, knock on wood, probably 2026 sometime, I think. Close to the end anyway, although academic publishing is, as you probably know, quite slow.
And you do have the process of peer review itself to go through still. So
I do.